It was a calm Saturday morning when I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, expecting the usual peace and quiet that came with living in my own home, my sanctuary. But as soon as I opened the door, I was met with a scene that didn't belong. Dozens of folding chairs lined my backyard, neatly arranged in rows. White and pink floral decorations were being fastened to rented arches, and a catering crew was unloading trays from the back of a van parked halfway across my driveway. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Maybe it was a neighbor's event, and they just accidentally set up in the wrong yard. But no, this was all happening on my property, the place I bought, paid for, and maintained without anyone's help. And not a single soul had asked me for permission. I walked into the yard, baffled and ready to shut it all down. That's when I was greeted by a woman with a clipboard and headset, barking orders at people like she owned the place. I asked her what was going on, and with a chipper smile that barely masked her condescension, she said, "Oh, this is the Johnson wedding. The HOA scheduled it here. You must be the homeowner. Don't worry, we'll clean everything up before Sunday." "Istere her, stund." Scheduled it here? The HOA? My HOA had apparently not only taken it upon themselves to book a full-blown wedding on private property, but also failed to even inform the owner of said property. Me. I demanded she stop everything immediately. Her smile faded as she told me I'd have to take it up with the HOA board because she was just the event coordinator. Apparently, this woman was hired weeks ago and had been working with the board on logistics. I asked if they had a contract, any formal agreement with me. And of course, there was none, because I never gave one. No email, no phone call, no paper trail that gave them the right to touch a single blade of grass on my lawn. But still, here they were. Dozens of strangers setting up tables, running extension cords across my property, and installing speakers like this was some public venue. I stormed back inside and grabbed my documents, property lines, HOA covenants, legal deeds, everything. As I flipped through the files, I couldn't find a single clause that even remotely allowed them to do what they were doing. I had always known the HOA could be overbearing. They'd send notices if your grass was half an inch too long or if your garbage bin stayed outside an hour too late. But this was beyond anything I'd imagined. They had crossed from nitpicking into trespassing, fully orchestrating an event on private land without authorization. And the worst part? They thought I would just go along with it. I started documenting everything. I took photos, videos, and recorded conversations. I wanted proof, every angle, every voice, every table they touched. I called a few neighbors, asking if they knew about this. Some were shocked. Others said they'd heard the HOA was trying something new to build community. Community? That's what they were calling this? An unauthorized occupation of someone's backyard? By the time the groom's family started arriving to check the layout, I had already contacted a lawyer. He nearly laughed on the phone when I explained the situation. Not because it was funny, but because it was so blatantly unlawful. The HOA had no legal right to use my home for a private event. It didn't matter who they were trying to impress or how nice the gesture seemed. What they had done was wrong. My lawyer asked if I wanted to file an injunction or press charges, but I told him to hold off for now. I watched as more decorations were put up, all while trying to keep my cool. My first instinct was to shut everything down immediately, to yell and scream until they left. But I realized something important. This wasn't just about a ruined weekend. It was about principle. It was about drawing a line that shouldn't have been crossed in the first place. The HOA had turned my property into a venue without consent, assuming I'd either be flattered or too passive to retaliate. But they were wrong. Very wrong. I called a few contacts, contractors, demolition crews, people I knew from previous work who could respond quickly and quietly. Not to destroy, but to prepare. If the HOA wanted to treat my home like it was part of their inventory, then maybe it was time to show them what happens when you forget who actually holds the deed. When I approached the HOA about the unauthorized wedding on my property, I expected them to react with shock or at the very least some kind of apology. Instead, I was met with smug smiles, indifference, and a level of arrogance that made my blood boil. I scheduled an emergency meeting with the board that same afternoon, demanding an explanation. Sitting across from me in that sterile clubhouse conference room were the same people who had sent me citations for painting my mailbox the wrong shade of beige. Now, those very individuals were acting like renting out my backyard for a stranger's wedding was just another line item on their community improvement plan. I asked them who had authorized the event, and the president of the HOA, Bill, a retiree who thought running the neighborhood was the same as running a corporation, barely looked up from his notes. The board voted on it, he said flatly. We believed it would be a good way to raise funds for future community upgrades. Your property is large and scenic. It seemed like the best location. I stared at him, stunned at the casual way he dismissed the matter. They had voted to use private property that wasn't theirs. No notification, no request, no attempt to include the homeowner in the discussion. Another board member chimed in with even more entitlement. She smiled and said, "It's only for a few hours, and we've promised them everything will be cleaned up. It's a win-win, really." I couldn't believe the words I was hearing. They were talking about my home as if it were a public park, as if I had signed up to be part of their fundraising schemes the moment I moved into the neighborhood. They spoke with the confidence of people who genuinely believed they were above the law. Worse, they were convinced that I should be grateful for the exposure. When I pointed out that they had zero legal authority to host an event on my property, they gave me a mix of shrugs and half-baked excuses. One of them said the community charter gave them rights over shared aesthetic spaces, whatever that meant. I reminded them that my home was privately deeded and sat outside the area designated as communal land. Their expression didn't change. It was like they believed their intentions justified their actions, as if a vote among 5 self-important neighbors gave them dominion over everything in the zip code. They then tried to shift the blame. The secretary claimed they thought I had been informed and had approved the event. She said someone might have left a notice on your porch weeks ago. I challenged her to show me a signed agreement, an email thread, anything that proved my consent. Of course, they had nothing. Just vague memories and false assumptions, backed by a dangerous amount of overconfidence. It wasn't just negligence. It was a complete disregard for boundaries and basic decency. When it became clear I wasn't going to play along, they got defensive. Bill warned me not to overreact and reminded me of the HOA's power to enforce fines and penalties. I almost laughed. Here they were threatening me for objecting to an event they had no right to organize. It was surreal. They genuinely believed that as long as they hid behind their bylaws and formal titles, they could get away with anything. They spoke like politicians at a press conference. Carefully worded phrases, no accountability, and a patronizing tone that only made things worse. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just some passive homeowner who would grumble and move on. I wasn't afraid of their warnings or their phony regulations. I had already spoken with legal counsel, already gathered documentation. I wasn't just pushing back. I was preparing a response that would leave no room for misinterpretation. Their arrogance had lit a fire under me. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about standing up to people who had convinced themselves they were above everyone else because they had clipboards and monthly meetings. I left that meeting not with peace of mind, but with absolute clarity. They had crossed the line, and they had done it with full confidence that I wouldn't fight back. They'd written off my voice, my rights, and my authority over my own land like it was just a minor obstacle to their social plans. But what they didn't realize was that this act of overreach had consequences. Their smug justifications, their blind confidence, their refusal to admit fault, all of it was going to come crashing down. Not just in a legal sense, but in a way they would never forget. The situation had quickly moved from offensive to outright illegal, and it was time to treat it as such. As I sat down with the property documents in one hand and the HOA's charter in the other, it became clearer by the minute that what they had done wasn't just unethical, it was a direct violation of property law. They had assumed authority where they had none, and in doing so, they had opened themselves up to a wide range of legal consequences. No clause, no amendment, no fine print in the HOA documents granted them the right to use private property for public or private events, let alone lease it to a third party for a commercial wedding ceremony. I had my attorney go through the HOA's bylaws line by line. He confirmed what I already knew deep down. This was a textbook case of HOA overreach. The property was individually deeded and registered under my name, not under any communal ownership or shared use classification. There was no easement that granted them access, no shared maintenance clause that could be misconstrued to justify what they had done. The HOA, in their ignorance or arrogance, had treated my land as if it were part of their amenities list. But this wasn't a clubhouse, a tennis court, or a greenbelt. It was my backyard, my home, and they had violated it without a shred of legal standing. The legal principle of trespass alone was enough to initiate a civil case. Every person on my property during that unauthorized setup, each caterer, decorator, and guest, was technically trespassing the moment they stepped past my gate. And the HOA, by orchestrating and facilitating the event, was legally liable for each one of them. My lawyer explained that this could also qualify as a misuse of HOA funds and authority, especially if they collected any form of payment or deposit for the use of my land. That added another layer of legal exposure. If money changed hands, they had not only overstepped, they had profited off it, and that turned a bad decision into a potential criminal offense. I also looked into local zoning laws. My property wasn't zoned for public events or commercial rentals, meaning that even if I had chosen to rent it out for a wedding, I would have needed to apply for permits, insurance, and inspections. The HOA had done none of that. They had skipped every legal requirement and still gone ahead as if they were hosting a picnic in a park. That recklessness wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. If anything had gone wrong during that event, a guest injured, a fire, and noise complaint, it would have been me held accountable because it was my address on the paperwork, my land under their feet, and my name on the insurance policy that covered the house. And then came the most infuriating discovery of all. The HOA had apparently created a rental agreement with the couple getting married. It wasn't even vague or informal. There was a document with an HOA letterhead, terms and conditions, and a payment schedule. The bride and groom had signed it. The HOA had signed it. My name, of course, appeared nowhere in the paperwork. They hadn't forged my signature, but they had impersonated my authority. That, my lawyer explained, could be considered fraud. At the very least, it was misrepresentation on behalf of the HOA board, and that alone could trigger a lawsuit that would bring the entire operation to a halt. I began collecting all possible evidence. Screenshots of the wedding advertisement that had been shared by local vendors, photos of the setup, testimony from guests and neighbors, copies of emails sent by the HOA discussing logistics. The more I uncovered, the worse it got. What started as an infuriating discovery was now clearly a coordinated operation done behind my back, and it was grounded in a false sense of entitlement. They thought they could get away with it because, in their minds, they were the authority. But the law didn't see it that way. The law respected ownership. It respected consent. And it certainly didn't respect HOAs making decisions about private land like it was their weekend project. My legal team prepared a cease and desist notice immediately. We also began drafting a civil suit, not just for trespassing, but for fraud, negligence, emotional distress, and loss of quiet enjoyment of my property. Every count we listed was backed by hard evidence and legal precedent. I wasn't bluffing. I wasn't threatening just to scare them. I was doing what needed to be done to protect the sanctity of property rights. Mine, and by extension, everyone else's who might one day find themselves in the crosshairs of an overreaching HOA. When the shock wore off and the legal groundwork was laid, I found myself staring out the window at the white tents rising in my backyard like monuments to arrogance. My first reaction had been disbelief, followed by anger, then disbelief again. But now, as I watched them casually continue setting up, rolling carpets, testing sound systems, lighting candles, it all became something else entirely. This wasn't just an intrusion. This was theft of control, of space, of peace. My privacy, my boundaries, my decision-making power, all hijacked by people who thought their committee vote could overrule ownership. That's when I realized my response couldn't just be legal. It had to be personal, tactical, loud enough that it would echo long after this wedding was over. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm outside and cause a scene. I knew that wouldn't work. These people thrived on order, on structure, on condescension dressed as civility. So I started thinking strategically. I went to my contacts, contractors, equipment operators, people who worked fast, quiet, and had no problem showing up on short notice. I explained what I needed, not destruction, not chaos, yet, but preparation. I wanted the message to be clear. I wasn't some passive homeowner. I was someone they had underestimated. While calls were being made and plans quietly drawn, I began collecting testimonies from neighbors. Turns out, a few of them had known something odd was going on. One mentioned the HOA had asked about event visibility from nearby streets. Another had seen trucks unloading floral arrangements early in the morning, but thought it was a party I had forgotten to mention. No one imagined the HOA would take this kind of liberty, but the hints had been there. That realization fueled my resolve even more. They had been whispering about this for weeks, plotting something massive, and just assuming I wouldn't find out until it was too late. I took my own walk around the neighborhood, greeting neighbors, asking casual questions, letting the story unfold in conversation. Reactions ranged from stunned silence to muttered curses. Many of them didn't even like the HOA, but were too afraid or tired to challenge them. They had accepted the board's overreach as a fact of life. But now someone had pushed back. Someone had drawn a line, and people were quietly paying attention. Back at the house, I made sure my security cameras were all functioning. I redirected 2 more toward the yard, just in case anything escalated. I walked through the house with a notebook, listing anything that might be damaged or moved. I checked locks, doors, gates, not out of fear, but to assert control. This was still my home, still my decision to make. I contacted local authorities, not to file a complaint just yet, but to inform them preemptively. I explained that an event was scheduled on my private property without permission and that I was taking legal and civil steps to address it. The officer I spoke with was surprisingly understanding. He said as long as I remained on the right side of the law, the HOA would be the ones answering questions if things turned sour. That call gave me more clarity. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was leading. That evening, as the setup neared completion and the wedding party arrived for rehearsal, I had a few trusted contractors swing by the property under the guise of checking the sprinkler system. No one asked questions. They wore vests, carried clipboards, nodded politely to the event staff. But what they were really doing was assessing the layout, taking notes on access points, and planning how fast they could move if I gave them the word. It wasn't just about ruining a party. It was about reclaiming authority. If the HOA wanted to pretend my home was theirs, I would remind them how quickly a space can become unrecognizable. In the meantime, I documented everything. The positioning of the tents, the wiring of the speakers, the catering tables edging into my flower beds. I counted vehicles and noted license plates. I took photos of vendors walking through my garden as if it were a public sidewalk. Every detail was stored, every moment recorded. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. We were dealing with a board that thinks they're untouchable. You don't just fight back. You build your case like a fortress. There were still a few hours before the wedding was set to begin. I watched from inside as guests started arriving in small groups, dressed in pastel colors and clutching invitations. They looked happy, unaware. The bride, radiant and smiling, walked across my backyard during golden hour as if it were the setting of a movie. And still, no one had asked me if they were allowed to be there. That's when I made the final call, the one that would turn this quiet rebellion into something they could never ignore. The decision wasn't made in a burst of rage or impulse. It came slowly, precisely, with the weight of everything that had led up to it pressing against my chest like a stone. I stood in the hallway with the phone in my hand, looking out at a scene that was never supposed to exist. The tents were up, the string lights glowing as dusk settled in. The DJ was testing the speakers with soft classical music, and waitstaff were circulating with trays of sparkling drinks on my lawn. Every piece of the event screamed exclusive, yet it all sat atop stolen ground. And the ones who had stolen it weren't criminals hiding in the shadows. They were the same people who claimed to be my neighbors, the same ones who cited me for leaving my garbage bin out for too long or planting flowers that didn't match the community palette. I dialed the number slowly, each digit a quiet rebellion. The contractor answered on the second ring. I didn't need to explain much. He already knew the situation from the earlier visit, and I simply gave him the time and the go-ahead. We coordinated a few final details, confirming access points, safety precautions, and timing. The plan wasn't destruction for chaos' sake. It was about sending a message so loud that it would drown out the sound system echoing from a tents. The HOA had forgotten that power without permission is nothing more than illusion, and it was time to break that illusion completely. While they laughed and posed for pre-wedding photos near my patio, the contractor and his team parked a few blocks away with a covered trailer. Inside was everything needed for a controlled partial teardown, loud, swift, and legal within the rights of a property owner removing unauthorized structures. I double-checked the documentation again. No signed lease, no written agreement, and no record of my approval. What they had erected was, in every legal sense, trespassing material. That meant I was well within my rights to remove it. What I was about to do wasn't vengeance. It was property maintenance, the kind they claimed to care so much about. At exactly 5:43 p.m., the rumble of machinery quietly rolled up the drive. Guests turned their heads, a few already holding up their phones. The HOA board members, who had been milling around near the catering tent, instantly began walking toward the front gate with nervous looks. I met them halfway. Their expressions twisted from confusion to panic as I calmly told them the event was over. Not postponed, not rescheduled. Over. I reminded them, with a firm and even voice, that they were hosting a commercial event without the property owner's consent, that the entire wedding was an illegal operation built on lies and assumptions. And now, it was being shut down. The contractor and his team moved quickly, professionally, dismantling one of the tent structures with precision. The noise of drills, metal poles hitting the ground, and fabric tearing from tension drowned out the wedding playlist. Gasps echoed from the crowd. The bride's face turned pale, and the groom was shouting at someone, though his voice was lost in the commotion. Guests began backing away, unsure whether to leave, help, or simply record the unfolding chaos. I stayed composed, unmoved, arms crossed, as the vision the HOA had forced into my backyard began to collapse. Literally, Bill from the HOA rushed up to me, red in the face, demanding an explanation, saying I was ruining everything. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him I was exercising my rights. I showed him the paperwork. I told him to get off my property. He tried to argue, to threaten, to cite some imaginary clause about community events, but there was no weight behind his words anymore. He had played the role of a small king for too long, and now the curtain had fallen. What was left wasn't authority. It was exposure. The bridal party fled the area as more equipment was loaded back into vans. The food was left untouched on the buffet tables. The DJ's equipment was unplugged mid-track. What should have been a moment of joy for the couple turned into confusion and embarrassment, not because of me, but because the people who promised them a dream venue never owned it in the first place. That was the part no one had told them. The HOA had pretended they had the right to rent my home like it was a clubhouse. They had signed agreements they weren't authorized to sign. They had made promises they couldn't keep. And now, the price of that deception was being paid in full. Even as the noise faded, the air was charged with something heavier than conflict. It was the undeniable realization, on every face present, that something had shifted, that a line had been drawn not just in my yard but in the power dynamic of the neighborhood itself. The HOA had overstepped, and now they had been pulled back with force. There were no more illusions about control, no more borrowed authority disguised as leadership. The board members, once so proud and composed, stood helpless amid the wreckage of their own arrogance, watching as every piece of their unauthorized fantasy was disassembled by the very homeowner they tried to ignore. The aftermath of what happened that day didn't unfold quietly. Word spread faster than I anticipated. Before the sun had even fully set, posts were already circulating on local forums and neighborhood group chats. Videos showed the tents coming down, people leaving in a rush, and the HOA members trying, unsuccessfully, to regain control of a situation they had no authority over to begin with. Some posts painted me as a monster who ruined a wedding. Others, however, were full of praise, calling me the only person who had ever stood up to the board and won. The community was split, but one thing was clear. No one was neutral anymore. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months started showing up at my door. Some just wanted to know what happened. Others came to apologize for not speaking up sooner. A few thanked me directly, saying they'd had their own run-ins with the HOA and were relieved someone finally pushed back. They were tired of the overregulation, the unnecessary fines, and the constant surveillance disguised as neighborhood management. Some admitted they had watched the entire event unfold from their windows and couldn't believe how far the board had gone. One neighbor, a quiet elderly woman from 2 streets over, brought me a pie and told me the HOA had once threatened to fine her for hanging a bird feeder too close to the edge of her porch. She said she wished she'd had the courage to do what I did. Meanwhile, the HOA board scrambled to manage the narrative. Emails were sent out, carefully worded to shift blame and paint the incident as a misunderstanding. They claimed there had been an internal communication breakdown, that they were under the impression the event had been cleared with me in advance. But the paper trail I had built said otherwise. Their rental agreement with the wedding party bore their signatures, not mine. The videos, the testimonies, the timeline, it all worked against them. The community, once docile and indifferent, now wanted answers. The bride's family also got involved, demanding refunds, threatening lawsuits, and holding the HOA directly accountable for the debacle. It was a storm the board had never experienced before. They weren't prepared for public backlash, legal threats, and most importantly, exposure. They had operated for years on the assumption that no one would dare challenge them, and now that someone had, their foundation was crumbling. Board members started resigning within the week. First, it was the secretary, then the treasurer, both citing personal reasons in their resignation letters. Behind closed doors, they were trying to distance themselves from liability. My legal case moved forward steadily. The cease and desist letter had already been issued, and now we were building toward a civil suit. My lawyer was confident. The HOA had violated multiple property laws, misrepresented authority, and endangered me legally and financially by hosting an unpermitted event on my land. We were claiming damages for trespassing, unauthorized commercial use of residential property, and emotional distress. The board had no viable defense, and the few arguments they tried to present were flimsy at best. They had no contract with me, no email confirmation, no verbal approval, nothing that would hold up in court. As the pressure mounted, new leadership started emerging within the HOA, people who were embarrassed by what had happened and wanted change. Some of them reached out to me directly, hoping to start fresh. They asked for advice, input, even an apology for what had been done. I listened cautiously. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. I wanted structures in place to prevent this from ever happening again, not just to me, but to anyone. So I proposed revisions to the HOA bylaws. New limits on board authority. Mandatory homeowner consent for all property-related decisions. A transparency clause requiring all meeting notes to be made public. To my surprise, the proposals weren't just accepted. They were applauded. Community meetings became packed overnight. People who had never attended a single HOA session now stood in line to have their voices heard. The apathy that had allowed the board to grow unchecked for years was gone, replaced by engagement, by oversight, by participation. It wasn't just a change in policy, it was a change in spirit. The neighborhood had finally woken up. Meanwhile, the couple whose wedding had been derailed found a new venue, and from what I heard, it went smoothly the second time around. They never contacted me directly, and I didn't expect them to. I knew their frustration wasn't aimed at me, but at the people who had promised them something they never had the right to give. I didn't take satisfaction in their ruined day, but I took pride in what it represented. A turning point, a moment when one homeowner stood firm, and everything that had been taken for granted by those in power finally came undone. What stayed with me most in the following weeks wasn't the legal victory or the headlines in the HOA newsletter. It was the quiet acknowledgments, the nod from neighbors passing by, the handwritten thank you note left on my porch, the sense that, for the first time, people felt like their voices mattered, that their property, their privacy, their peace meant something again. What the HOA tried to take by force had been reclaimed, And not just by me, but by a community that had finally remembered how to say no.